Well, we're here at the ShareGate office in Montreal with Jasper Oosterveld from InSpark, all the way from the Netherlands. Hi, Jasper.
Hi, Ben. It's good to be here.
It's been a long time. I think we met each other at SPC 2012, SharePoint conference, all the way back in 2012. That was a long time ago.
We're still young, wild, and crazy.
Very, very different world in SharePoint as well. I don't think we were talking about Office 365 that much. And today, of course, the world has changed. We're talking about Office 365 these days more and more. And we're talking about many, many different aspects of collaboration. And some of the things that we've seen is the deployment of teams. And for me, I don't know, maybe you have some funny stories too, but what I find interesting is back in the days, and we're talking about 2012 when we were talking about SharePoint, and no one understood it. So I had to explain, I don't know if it was the case for you, but well, you have file shares and now you're going to team sites. And so you have to forget folders. You're gonna go to document libraries with metadata, but folders isn't bad necessarily, and it's a site and it's web-based and so on. And now we've come to understand SharePoint. And now the same thing is happening with, okay, now there's teams. What's teams versus team site and how should we work now? And so it's like a transition, and we've seen some pretty funny stories. I don't know if you have some funny stories to share around this, like teams concept that have arrived in your customers.
Yeah, I think that's people are very struggling with like how does SharePoint relate to Teams? Like they say like SharePoint is Teams. It's like, well, no, it's like it's still its own thing, and they're like, you know, Teams benefits from SharePoint for storing the files. But like a funny story I actually heard recently was a customer. They are based in the Netherlands, but they also have branches around the world, and they have one branch in the States.
Yeah.
And they have Teams enabled, so people are able to create teams, but they don't have any real governance in place. So you probably guess where this is going. So what they told me is that like an employee in the States, he just created a team called Test, and for some reason he uploaded full of sensitive data, and then
he actually started working with Test.
I don't know what it's. Well, fine. He thought it was a good idea apparently. And then he also thought it was a good idea to throw all the content on there, basically almost all the content of the country.
Yeah.
And then, of course, somebody from IT was like, well, this is Test, it's fine, can go, and deleted it. And then people in the States like, where did all the data go?
Yeah, that's some pretty bad stories. I've seen some pretty funky stuff. Most of the things that we've seen before was SharePoint environments not created with the right structure. So at some point we even saw an entire intranet built under the central administration with subsites and now we're seeing similar concepts happening with the Teams environment where everything has been done in the same place, or they're going the opposite way and they're creating thousands of teams everywhere, and then they can't find that structure that they need to get to. So we've seen some pretty, but do you have any like horror stories that you've seen on your side of Teams deployment gone horribly wrong, other than Test, of course?
Yeah. Well, I do have some stories, but then I don't think you're able to leave this room.
Well, yeah, there's some customer stories. We have to keep them for ourselves.
Yeah, exactly,
I completely agree. So we've seen these things. You've seen the test happen. You've seen people creating things all over the place. And we said that they don't understand SharePoint versus Microsoft Teams rather. One's a chat room that allows everything to be joined together with the tabs, and then Team Sites, the content service where things are stored. But what would be some tips that you could give to people using Microsoft Teams? So how to get started. So if somebody or an organization is about to get started with Microsoft Teams tomorrow and they don't have Jasper Oosterveld to help them, what tips would you give them to make sure that they can run?
Yeah, I definitely would advise to start looking at governance. So, and then basically at a couple of elements. So you have to think, who is able to create a team? Are we going to allow everybody to do it, or just a selection of people? That's like the first decision I think you should take, because there is a risk of if you open it up that everybody will create a team and it gets a little bit out of control, or you turn it off. But I'm not a big fan of that either. So I think you should rather go for open for all, but with some policies in place to at least have some control and management. So you should first start with that, and then you need to think about, okay, I have that in place. You know, these are my rules. And now, how am I going to handle, for example, external access? Am I going to allow every team to invite external people? So you have to make a decision around that as well.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then the next one will be like expiration policies. Do I want these teams to last forever? I think I wouldn't do that, because why? It's like just because you have the space doesn't mean you should do it. So you need to think about expiration as well, and then also a little bit around naming convention. I think if you start with that, and it doesn't have to take much time. It's not like it takes you weeks to set up. Like that, a couple of days, think about it, write it down, discuss internally some policies, procedures, and then also start small. Like try to start small and maybe start with like a pilot group.
No, I agree.
Go to like a department that has the most need for like collaboration and help them out, and then they can try it out and then try to roll it out in like in steps.
I 100% agree. What I've seen, often the categories come back often. We say you have to think about provisioning, you have to think about your life cycle, you have to think about your classification and naming. And so these categories often come back. But I like what you said, that it doesn't have to be this big thing. Of course, you have to consider everything that's happening in your business and the impact that it can have, but you can start small. And I 100% agree with your provisioning statement in terms of understanding who can create your teams. But I'm always careful because it's, like you said, you don't want to turn off self-service, or at least in my opinion, because it's always a challenge of finding the balance between what IT wants and what IT needs to do to make sure Teams is successful in the company, but follows the rules of compliance, of security, of making sure there's no breach of data. And then on the other side, you have end users who know how the internet works now.
Yeah.
So they can go get whatever they want. And the more we block and the more we have processes that are complicated or long for the end user, I find the easier it is for them to say, well, I'm gonna go get myself this thing online and then we'll deal with IT later.
Yeah, that's like the reason like Dropbox has become so popular in Box, and because that was the alternative to something they didn't have internally.
Yeah.
Like they have the internet and they're like, well, file storage or for file sharing, Dropbox, create an account.
Yeah, I mean, just here too, it was one of our problems, not necessarily Dropbox, we have Office 365, but we had these processes. So what happens is little things for note taking, right? People weren't sure exactly how to quickly create a page. Or they had to ask permission to be able to do it in a certain site. So what happens is all of a sudden I had Evernotes everywhere in the company, but when people leave the company, then so do the Evernotes. So definitely a lot of the questions that you were asking, who can create Office 365 groups? And I say Office 365 groups because it's the thing behind Microsoft Teams. And we always have to wonder, because it's not whether or not, what I think interesting with the question of provisioning, it's not that you want this person or not this person to create these teams. It's the impact that each creation has on the environment. One team is actually 8 products at the same time being created, an email address being generated, a URL being generated. So you have to make sure that it's going in the right direction and you can guide them. And that's what we just want them to have, a good use of their environment. So for sure. So what did we say? We said provisioning, figure out who can create, don't go overboard with blocking self-service, try to find the guidelines.
Balance,
Then we talked about naming convention to try and organize and help people know where things should be. We talked about end of life. You said expiration policies. Yeah. Not everyone have access to them, of course, because they're in the Azure AD Premium licenses. But of course, expiration policies when things need to go away. Personally, I think it's important just because of, I'm not even sure it's a proper word, but searchability is, as we create more and more teams, there's 2 things that happens. It's hard for navigation, because you have these unlimited teams inside of your teams, and we all know that.
And finding teams in the Teams application is not the best thing there is.
And most of them are not used in some cases. So can they be gone? And can we keep the archived content somewhere, for example, to get it back later? So that's definitely a point. So we talked about that. We talked about naming convention. We talked about some figuring out external sharing, how that works. And then you touched a little bit about classification, right?
Yeah, a little bit,
Can you explain, I think we talked a bit earlier before this talk, you talked about classification and the importance of doing it on, and we mean labels, on content. Can you tell me about that story again? I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, because like what we've seen in the last years is that a lot of companies moved all their content to the cloud. And that's great, because that makes it easier accessible, and like the most innovations are in the cloud, and that's where you can collaborate in the best way. But having accessibility is also a risk, because that basically means everybody can access it from any device, any location. And of course you need access to access to your data, right? And like we have our InSpark tenant, I need my InSpark account to get in, but in theory, I could just grab a document and just send it out through email, and nobody would have any idea that I did that. And that basically means people who shouldn't have access to the document, the presentation, can access it. So by looking into data classification, by using still Azure Information Protection, that's basically moving to sensitivity labels in Office 365, you can put some encryption on a document. So for example, if internally I'm working on a presentation that has sensitive content, I can classify it as InSpark confidential. So when I do that, like what means all my colleagues can still access it, but if they would send it outside to you, for example, you cannot open it. You get the presentation.
And does everyone have access to sensitivity labels, or do you need special licenses?
No, everybody can use it.
So everyone can do what you're talking about right
yeah,
now.
exactly.
Excellent.
Yeah. And basically, you define the labels, so public, internal, confidential. And then the nice thing is you can also define it to a department. So you can say, if I'm part of IT, my standard label is confidential, and only IT people can access those documents, nobody else. So that, but the downside now is that it's at content level, and what we want it at team level. So if I create a team and I say this team is about a merger, and I label it as highly confidential, I want something to happen. I want, for example, external access to be disabled. I want all the content to be encrypted, and that's not there yet. And I know Microsoft is working very hard on that. But
I've heard about that for many years. At least 2 years we heard about it. I remember at a keynote at Ignite where put the labels now on the teams, on the group. When you create a site, you can ask, and then policies would eventually apply to it. So definitely looking forward to that as
you
well.
have classification labels, but it's just a label. It
It's
does
just
nothing.
text.
Yeah, text. Basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about security right now, right? We're talking about having labels with sensitivity labels. Of course, there's retention labels, but applying a label with policies, which to me talks about security of an environment and protecting the work that happens inside of a team. How do you deal, or have you heard or seen challenges with external users or guests? What stories? I know I have some that I've seen, but what have you seen with that?
I think with the arrival of Teams, it became a little bit more complicated, I feel, because when we still had SharePoint, or we still SharePoint, when we just had SharePoint as a project site, for example, you could invite somebody and then give that person just a certain permission level, like read or edit, or for contributor full control. Or you just share the document. But now if you invite an external person within a team, they get access to everything within SharePoint. And I think most customers don't realize that. Yeah. And that can have a huge negative impact. And I think that's why so many customers are waiting for such a long time for the private channel to arrive, because that means like, okay, I do invite somebody within a team, but just for that private channel, so they don't necessarily get access to all the content. Yeah,
what's important to understand, and I've been trying to share it, it's just complicated in how it works, is to understand the concept of Office 365 group membership provider. So you have SharePoint as a product, and SharePoint has its own system of access control list. So it has libraries, it has folders, it has documents, and you can grant people different access to these files. That's one thing. And then above the SharePoint site, you have this concept of an Office 365 group, which manages who's in the Microsoft Teams that's attached to the team site, which manages who has access to their team site, manages Planner. And as soon as you add people inside of the Office 365 group, no matter what layer, member or owner or guest from outside the company, they'll have access to the entire SharePoint site and the teams, right? No matter what so definitely seen a lot of what you're talking about, where people are not sure or didn't realize that adding a person was actually granting them access.
Yeah, that's a huge impact. Yeah.
So what can we do in terms of managing external users in Microsoft Teams and in the SharePoint, which is the content service for Teams?
I would also think about what type of team would I want people to invite external guests, for example? Because if, let's say, you create a team for HR department or R&D, IT, I don't think you need external people accessing that, because it's like, that's internal. Like, and if they want to collaborate with external people, they can create a team for that purpose, for example, for projects. And I think that's where you should set your policy to. If you use a team for projects, then external collaboration is allowed. So that's one thing. But then you also should think about what are external people able to do. So if you go to the Teams Administration Center, there's a lot of settings you can change to determine what external people are or aren't allowed to do. So for example, we are part of like some teams in the Microsoft tenant, and they turn off that you're not able to delete your own comments, your own replies. And that's like, I get it, but it's super annoying because sometimes you click enter too quick and it's like, oh, well, now I have a reply that does not make any sense, but you cannot delete it. So those are the kind of settings like they can change. But I also think you should frequently check what teams have external access enabled, and what you also would like to see is what is shared externally. So I looked at ShareGate Apricot, and they have a fantastic system in place where you can actually see what teams have shared external shared content with what external people, and it gives you a lot more options for like managing that, because then you can be like, as an admin, like, I see this team, that's fine. But this looks like sensitive content. They shared it externally. Oh, I don't think that's, I want to verify that's actually allowed.
Yeah.
So that's what I really like about the ShareGate Apricot, that they're making the easy.
Yeah, I mean, it's what we saw on the, and we did a lot of research, and there was a lot of things around external sharing that it becomes complicated because you scale with Office 365. You create more and more teams, which means more and more files, and it means each team have more and more power to share things. Yeah. And as IT in the admin center, you don't know if that file is good or not to be shared outside. So this whole thing of showing to the group owners and to the people in the team that these are the things shared outside and frequently validated is definitely something that we got a lot of good feedback on.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think you should enable external access, because what we said, people will find a different way, and then it's out of your control and out of your reach. I do think I'm not a fan of working with anonymous links, and to be honest, I've not seen many customers using that, because I think that's just asking for problems.
Yeah.
But I do think you should enable it and then leave it up to the owners of a group, for example, of a team, to invite external people. What you also can do is say IT needs to invite people first, but I don't think IT people are really looking forward to do that, because it became really like an 8-hour job to just manage external people. So leave it up to the owners, but definitely have something in place to frequently check, like who is a part of our tenant, what they have access to, and is that allowed.
I agree.
Yeah.
100% agree. And it's something that you touch on some very good points in terms of external sharing, in terms of guess who has access to what. It scales very quickly too in an environment. So just as a good point about this department sites, there should never be possibly external sharing. That's going to be project based at that point. So just education on that front could be very helpful as well. And then you talked about the settings in the admin center for teams for what can external users do, but there's also a lot of settings in Azure AD that everyone has access to, but not always goes in check, that allows you to say who is allowed to be an external user. So some settings on who can become an external user, and you can block by domain, for example. So if you know you're working with certain companies, you can approve the domain, and then you can invite anyone there and it will work. So there's tons and tons of controls. I'm not saying this one's a good one or that one's a good one, but there's what they can do, and there's who can be an external user and who can invite an external user.
Yeah, and the challenge is it's so spread out. That's kind of the problem. It's like SharePoint Online has its settings, OneDrive has its settings, Teams has its settings, Azure AD has its settings.
I still get lost in it.
Yeah, it's also for us. It's difficult sometimes to kind of, okay, this setting is there, this is there. And then some stuff is in PowerShell.
Yeah.
And that would be really nice if you could centralize that and just making it easier for, especially with IT admins.
Yeah. What's happening? Who has access? How do they have access? And is it okay?
Yeah. And I know Microsoft is definitely improving that. It's a lot better than it used to be, but there are definitely some steps that need to be taken. Yeah.
Absolutely. And do you still consider or hear customers that are in Slack not wanting to go to Teams or vice versa? Do you still see that, or all your customers have made the switch to Teams?
Yeah, I haven't had really any customers who were part of Slack.
Because I hear sometimes, I see it even here in Montreal, where people are looking at both or have Slack and not making the Teams switch, and it really isn't. I find it's not comparable, other than, yes, it's a chat tool, but what Teams is trying to do is, and this is marketing words of Microsoft, but is the hub for teamwork.
Yeah.
But the difference here is that you have a place where you can chat. Okay, features matched. And I'm sure the experience, we have tons to talk about, like how the experience is in Slack and how the experience is in Teams, but the value in Teams is the tabs and the channels of your team, where you can bring something from even a third party, not Microsoft, directly inside of your Microsoft team.
The integrated experience.
It's the integrated experience, 100%. And that really is what I've seen of when people are still. I saw a company recently switch from Slack to Teams actually in our industry, and just was okay because now they got the integrated experience fully.
Oh yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know what it is. Yeah, yeah, and yeah, it's not perfect, but it's definitely. I like that end users are able to work within context of their work. They don't have to switch between 5 applications to get their job done.
No.
Like they're on a team in Teams, and they can chat, they can work with their files, they have their tasks, and then we'll work with videos. If you want, you can integrate external applications. And I think that's really the power of Teams. I think, you know, that no, it sounds a bit of marketing, but it is true. Like that's why the adoption is easier too than it used to be, for example, with SharePoint, like the classic SharePoint, like modern SharePoint is a lot better with adoption. But Teams works so well because of that. It's relatively easy to understand for end users how it works.
Absolutely.
And yeah, for sure.
And if you had any predictions, we're about to go to Microsoft Ignite. We know some of the things coming out, but longer term, where do you see all of this going? Office 365, Teams, the whole thing in general. I mean, go ahead and go broader than just Teams. Where do you see things going? And if you had to talk to a customer and not breach any NDA that you have, but simply try to truly guide them into the direction of where you think Microsoft is going with everything, what do you think you would be telling that person?
I have the feeling Microsoft is going more and more towards like AI, like and helping the business user making decisions and providing them with the content they need and the people they need to get their work done. And so, because what you said before, it's like there's so much content now available and there's so many people available. It's really hard to find the right person, the right content. And Microsoft has been trying to do that. I mean, with Delve, for example, and they think those were the first steps. And you kind of see that with Microsoft Search, how's it developing right now in SharePoint. If you, for example, click in the search bar, it shows you what you've searched before and it suggests stuff. I think that's where it will go more and more because there's just too much data for us to process and make a decision. You want like an AI to do that for you. And ideally, that will also happen for classification of content, and it will see, it scans the document, okay, I see that this is sensitive, I'll automatically apply that label for you. So I think the broader picture will be more that, like AI and making our lives easier. If you look at Teams, I have the feeling more and more stuff will be done in Teams. And for example, if you look at Yammer, some people probably won't like me saying this, but I have the feeling eventually Teams can replace Yammer. I see more and more features appearing in Teams. For example, the company-wide team, the activity feeds extended with trending, suggested. You can now have moderators. So let's say Teams introduce best reply or like hashtags or like what will be people preventing them to not use Teams? Because then again, you're in this one tool, you don't have to go somewhere else. I don't know what's gonna happen, but to me it feels like it's going that way. Yeah. One thing I do want to say is that I was talking to another MVP and she made a good remark. She said, I have the feeling Teams is kind of going in the same waters as SharePoint used to be, that it has to do everything. You remember SharePoint 2007? It had to do Power BI, it had to do search, it has to do workflow, content management, and it wasn't good enough for that. And that's the risk for Teams. I kind of like, if they're not careful, it can go wrong as well. Like, you know, I know they're trying to do a lot, but also sometimes they have to make a decision like, okay, this just doesn't work. We'll have a different tool for that.
100% agree with actually everything that you just said. We have more and more data in Office 365. Microsoft has more and more data because more customers are on there. So they have that telemetry, that leverage to be able to build AI driven features, also machine learning and machine teaching. And what does that mean is that they'll be able to use their data to propose something to a business user and have the user say, yes, it's true, or no, it's not true, and build that engine even further. So I can definitely see with the trends happening in productivity space worldwide across all platforms, Microsoft owning the data and being able to bring the features to a level that becoming essentially the Netflix of services, is they have so much data that only they can make the recommendations that they're making because the other ones are not being used as much as they were. So I think you're 100% right in this sense, or at least I agree with your prediction in terms of AI driven, 100%. And what I've seen, because they just released their Q1 earning report, Microsoft, and although there's huge percentage of growth in terms of Office 365, revenue is not necessarily growing. Why? Because now they've got everybody.
Yeah,
right.
So basically on
that's
there,
why we saw them having an acquisition for company to bring things from outside of Office, of SharePoint and Microsoft products, and bring people from Google, bring people from Dropbox. And I anticipate, and my guess will be that they'll start going upwards in the licenses in the terms of trying to, since they have all the customers, how do they get more revenue from the existing customers? So what's going to be good is that we're going to see more and more interesting projects and interesting value added to Office 365 that will be beneficial for customers, and then they'll choose whether or not they want it or not. And in terms of Teams, I haven't thought about it, but I agree. It's a dangerous place. I was thinking about SharePoint, and to be honest with you, with your comment about becoming too much, because in the past we saw SharePoint becoming too much, too many features, too many buttons, too many links, and is what we call classic SharePoint today. Now they've rebuilt it, and it's modern SharePoint today, and we liked it because easy, lean, simple to understand. And I'm worried sometimes because I'm seeing more and more buttons coming back. So even in SharePoint, I'm seeing like the bar becoming bigger, the buttons becoming longer, the settings becoming, oh, well, we need a button. Well, we need and I'm worried that we go back into that mindset. But from a Teams perspective, 100% agree with you, 100%.
Yeah, although I do think that, especially since Jeff Teeper came back a couple years ago, that they do have a good focus now. It's like they, like workflow. No, it's not our thing. We can do it with Flow. Yeah. Like you can use Power Apps to make your forms, and in search there will be Microsoft Search. But I do agree, it's a little bit. You see a trend coming back. But I do think they have a good focus though at what SharePoint should be good at and is good at. I think that's definitely what's gonna save them basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Well, Jasper, thank you very much for visiting us here. I think this was a great chat about Teams. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about some of the horror stories. We talked about some of the things that we have to cover. If you have tips to give, we talked about make sure you have questions around provisioning in terms of who can create, not necessarily to block, but rather what are the impact and who has that impact. We talked about naming convention, just having a right naming in place. We talked about external security. We talked about lifecycle management for end of life, but during regularly checking permissions with external user, which is always a good thing, but also to get that visibility. And thanks for mentioning ShareGate Apricot, of course, in that. We talked about Slack versus Teams, and what the difference is really is that both are chat tools, but Teams is that integrated experience with not just Microsoft productivity tools, but many more others. And then we kind of chatted a bit of where we think things are going, and it sounds like it's an exciting place where we're in a good spot.
Yeah, it's definitely changed a lot since we met, and I think that's definitely a good thing.
And if people want to follow you, where should they reach Jasper Oosterveld?
I'm on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And probably if you have any questions, the best place to ask me is on LinkedIn. Just send me a message, and then I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Yeah,
perfect. Well, again, thanks for visiting us, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you.